Great. And Vivian, I'll pass it over to you for public participation.
Thank you, Chair. And Thomas is just going to pull up the slides and I'll go through them. But just want to start out by thanking community members for being with us at the planning board meeting tonight. And I will just read some rules of decorum for public participation for tonight's meeting. So we don't have any public hearing items. We have open comment at the beginning of the meeting where members from the public can speak to other issues not on the agenda. So I'll just go through these. The city is engaged with community members to co-create a vision for productive, meaningful, and inclusive civic conversations. And we want our community members to know that the vision supports physical and emotional safety for community members, staff, and board commission members, as well as democracy for people of all ages, identities, lived experiences, and political perspectives. And we have a lot more detail on this vision on our website. Next slide, please. I don't know if you can do presentation mode. And the following are examples of rules of decorum found in the Boulder Revised Code and other guidelines that support this vision. And these will all be upheld during this meeting. First, all remarks and testimony shall be limited to matters related to city business. No participant shall make threats or use other forms of intimidation against any person. Obscenity, racial epithets, and other speech and behavior that disrupts or otherwise impedes the ability to conduct the meeting are prohibited. And participants are required to identify themselves using first and last name so that we can call on you using those. Next slide, please. And just quickly, in case you're not familiar, we're in the Zoom webinar format. So when we call for people to speak who are interested to speak, you can hover your mouse or finger over the bottom of your screen where you see this raised hand icon. And if you're joining by phone, you can do the same thing, raise your hand using star. Next slide. And these are just showing a few more ways to get to that icon. So those are the rules decorum for public participation, and now we'll go into the open comment, if that's okay. So please raise your hand if you wish to share any comments with the planning board, and each person would have 3 minutes to speak. And I'll just give folks a few seconds to see if any hands are raised. Looks like we don't have anyone who wishes to speak at this time. So back over to you, Chair.
Okay, thanks. Well, there's no one here, but we have everyone here in attendance, which I think is a first in a while. So we'll just jump quickly into, we have 2 sets of minutes to approve. I don't know if anyone has any commentary or if anyone would like to make a motion to approve the first set of minutes from April 16th, 2024.
Move to approve.
Second.
Kurt seconds. I'm going to go ahead and just do a quick roll call of the people that were there. Laura?
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. Hold on just a minute. Mark?
Yes.
ML?
Yes.
Kurt?
Yes.
Claudia?
Yes.
Mason?
Yes.
And myself, George, yes. So that is approved. We'll go to the next set of meeting minutes. I just lost my packet here. Second. Lost my connection. Does anyone want to make a move to approve that second set of meeting minutes?
Move to approve.
Second.
Okay, and I'll do the same roll call. Kurt?
Yes.
ML?
Yes.
Mark?
Yes.
Laura?
I was absent.
Okay. Claudia?
Yes.
Mason?
Yes.
And I approve as well. Okay, great. That concludes the approval of the meeting minutes. And now I think we're jumping straight to matters. But before we get into matters, I know Hella had something she wanted to quickly mention.
Yeah, I am very excited to introduce Christy Fitch to you all tonight. She's joining us virtually, and she is a new attorney with our office. And she'll be joining Laurel and I in working with the planning department and advising the planning board. Christy's coming from Adams County, where she's worked as a land use attorney for, I believe, at least 7 years and has lots of experience working with boards. So expect her to be watching for a little while and then sitting in the seat.
Good evening, everyone. I'm excited to get to work with y'all coming up. And like Hella said, I'll be filling in. I think my first meeting is in August, so you'll see me around.
Great, welcome.
Welcome. Welcome.
All right. I think we only have one matters item if we want to go ahead and have staff introduce it, and we'll go from there.
All right. Hello, planning board members. My name is Sarah Horn, and I am a planner on the comp planning team, and I'm here tonight with KJ, Christopher Johnson, the comprehensive planning manager, and I'm going to start this presentation really quickly, and then we'll get started. Okay. Let's see. Here. Okay, so it's my first time in front of you tonight. I'm very glad to be here with you. And I am here to talk about the East Boulder zoning update. And the last time you heard about this project, Kathleen King was in front of you. There is no chance I can fill her shoes, but I am helping her with this project, and we'll keep moving it forward while she's gone. And like I said a minute ago, we have an amazing team. Christopher Johnson, I'm the comp planning manager, and then there are several other colleagues that are here online, and they might chime in the discussion portion of the presentation. And just as a quick reminder, Kathleen was before you in October of 2023 to describe the project and to discuss some areas in the city where form-based code has been applied to date, and to go over some of the challenges, benefits, and areas where improvements could be made. She identified and talked about some of those. And then she came back in March of this year to discuss the zoning strategy. And tonight, our focus is the draft form-based code updates. So in terms of our agenda, I'm going to go over the East Boulder subcommunity planning process and how its recommendations have directed the proposed changes we're going to present to you tonight. Then KJ will discuss the draft form-based code updates in more detail. And once he's finished, I'll quickly touch on next steps, and then we'll open it up for questions and discussion. So just to quickly reorient everyone to the area, East Boulder is one of the 10 subcommunities in the city. On the left side of the screen, you see it outlined in black. And then the zoom in on the right just touches on the boundaries, Foothills Parkway on the west, the airport to the north, Valmont City Park, and the power plant to the east, and Arapahoe Avenue to the south. And within these boundaries, the East Boulder subcommunity planning process took place over a 3-year time frame from 2020 to 2022. It included extensive community engagement and developed a vision for the future of the area. And based on this vision, the plan lays the groundwork to provide a good environment for business and industry, especially small-scale industrial and manufacturing spaces, life sciences and technical office space, to introduce housing opportunities in locations that have traditionally been strictly employment-focused, to celebrate and support East Boulder's unique character, and to foster better connections via planned regional transit facilities within East Boulder to the city and the larger region. 4 areas of change were also identified as part of the planning process. These are locations where the community anticipates the greatest amount of change over time. They're highlighted in blue on the screen. And to facilitate and direct change in these areas to be consistent with the community's vision, recommendations, including the consideration of form-based code, were developed to again enhance the unique character of East Boulder, to nurture housing opportunities, and to promote a more economically resilient, walkable place. In tandem with the subcommunity plan adoption and related to the areas of change, the comprehensive plan land use map was also updated to better align with the vision for East Boulder. The land use map updates were made in locations only within the areas of change, and you can see them highlighted in red on the screen. The updates included adding mixed-use transit-oriented development, which you see in the pink-purple hatch within those red lines, and then mixed-use industrial, which is the gray hatched area within those red boundaries. And there were no land use changes made in any other locations in the East Boulder subcommunity plan on the land use, on the comprehensive plan land use map. So along with that quick overview of how we got here, I just want to quickly review the process to date. In addition to adopting the subcommunity plan and the Boulder Valley comprehensive plan land use updates, we also updated the transportation master plan connections plan to better align with the subcommunity plan. And then all three of these documents now talk to each other and are headed in the same direction. So that brings us to now, working on the first major implementation step to help realize the vision and of the East Boulder Subcommunity Plan and tie together all the previous planning work, the future zoning strategy, and form-based code updates. And as I mentioned earlier, when Kathleen came to you last time, she talked about the draft zoning strategy, which includes strategic edits to the use tables to better align with the subcommunity plan, and creating a roadmap to apply new zone districts in the areas of change as properties come online with substantial redevelopment or new development proposals. And tonight, we want your feedback on the second item, the form-based code updates. So to help inform your discussion in terms of engagement, we've held 4 focus group meetings early in the process. We had 3 technical advisory committee meetings, and we held our last week to review this public review draft. We conducted a business survey earlier this spring to understand how people are using their spaces, especially small manufacturing and maker spaces. I held virtual office hours 2 weeks ago, and we posted the public review draft on the project website on May 28th, and it will be up for comment until this Friday. And some of the requests and desires we're addressing through the form-based code updates that we've gotten through feedback are providing more process predictability, providing more flexibility to accommodate creativity and manufacturing spaces, and to provide spaces for micromobility. Those are just a few of the requests we've gotten. And then some of the concerns with the form-based code that we've heard are the 10% allocation of first floor for production space. That's one of the suggestions we're making. Floor height and building articulation requirements, and KJ will talk a little bit more about those in a minute. And then residential requirements, understanding if those could be optional in certain areas. And then in terms of council feedback, we met with them last Thursday to discuss the draft, and they mentioned a few things, and some of these to help inform your discussion include, like I just mentioned, that we got from community feedback, the residential requirements. They'd like us to revisit these in the primary office and light industrial areas, and they think that while we should revisit them, they may be appropriate in the primary TOD areas. They mentioned code complexity and flexibility. They want us to continue to streamline the requirements, potentially be a bit less prescriptive in areas, and some members thought the change from 60 to 40% redevelopment to kick in the form-based code might make it more difficult for adaptive reuse, and some members were interested in that. The rezoning process, one member was concerned that it might add unnecessary complexity to the process, as people will have to go forward with the zoning request change along with the form-based code. So they were concerned about that. The call-up procedure, they were more comfortable with the increase to 2 planning board members for call-ups, but they are of the opinion that it should be a majority of members, so the process becomes more administrative generally over time. There was a concern about open space and density, just thinking about the fact that we're not seeing open space increase commensurate with the addition of new residents, so to try to balance that more in the future. Frontage designations were another item that there was concern that the highest design requirements face heavy vehicle streets, and there was concern about that, and maybe they should be more focused on pedestrian, bicycle-oriented areas. And then the FBC check-in, there was a request that maybe we check in on the FBC within a certain time period or after a certain number of projects are completed to make sure it's doing what we want it to do and to be able to make adjustments. And then the final item that I'll talk about is alternative compliance with the FBC. Currently, within the areas of change, redevelopment must comply with the FBC, and there are some members that would like us to explore an option where there could be an off-ramp to use site review instead. And just to note, staff have concerns around the additional code complexity and potential administrative burden that would result from this type of setup, and we can talk about that more during the discussion if you'd like. So keeping all of that in mind, I just threw a lot at you quickly. Our key question for you as KJ walks you through the draft updates in just a moment is, do you have questions or comments on the draft form-based code updates as they relate to the East Boulder Subcommunity Plan recommendations that were listed in your memo? And with that, I'll turn it over to KJ to walk you through the changes.
Thank you, Sarah. Good evening, Planning Board. And one additional member that is part of our team, her name is Leslie Oberholzer. She's our consultant from Codametrics, who really did the lion's share of the work on updating the form-based code. Unfortunately, she's traveling tonight, so she's not here with us. So I'm going to do my best to fill her shoes and provide some more details on the proposed updates within the form-based code. So the first thing I want to start with is just to remind everybody really what the intent of the form-based code is, and that it is really intended to create more predictable outcomes, and that's related to the overall building massing scale, the permeability of the building, addition of transparency in windows, et cetera. It's organized around building types and frontages. So it's really trying to describe how the building is designed to relate to the public realm at the street level and other defined outdoor spaces. It does not entirely ignore uses, which is sometimes a common misconception. When the form is clearly defined, the buildings then are able to accommodate a variety of uses, and the form-based code has an opportunity to guide where in a building those uses might be most appropriate. The other thing is really the code is intended to assist with the implementation of the East Boulder Subcommunity Plan. So for example, through the site review process, there are requirements to be consistent with any adopted plans that are in place. The form-based code, as more intended to be more of an administrative review, is those recommendations from the plan are sort of built into the code so that we're capturing that through the process as opposed to through a more discretionary process, if that makes sense. Next slide. So where the form-based code would apply. So as Sarah mentioned, the form-based code is proposed to only apply to those areas of change that were identified in the sub-community plan. So that's around the 55th and Arapahoe Station area, Valmont Park East and West, and then the Flatirons Business Park. The rest of the East Boulder Subcommunity Plan area would remain under its existing zoning structure and continue forward. The form-based code implements the place types. So that is that was this new idea that was introduced within the subcommunity plan that's really intended to try to bridge the gap between our land use designations within the comprehensive plan, which are very, very broad, and then ultimately the zone districts, which are much more detailed. So the place types describe that mix of uses, the types of sort of outcomes and design character that we're looking for. The other thing that's unique about East Boulder is that, as Kathleen explained back in March, we're proposing an approach where future rezonings and future redevelopment would need to be consistent with a proposed zoning map. So rather than proceeding with a city-initiated rezoning process right now, where we would change the zoning to properties that are in place, we would essentially create a future zoning map that would be amended and added to the East Boulder Subcommunity Plan so that only when a property owner actually initiates a redevelopment project, they would then come into compliance with that future zoning map. And I'm more than happy to go into more details on that. Another clarification, and I think it's really important to describe this, as we've heard some feedback from community members and others about questions of when would the form-based code apply. Right now, the way that this is proposed is that if the form-based code was adopted tomorrow, essentially nothing changes to that existing property. Their existing zoning still applies. Their existing uses are still conforming. Everything continues forward. So, existing properties can continue the use of those properties. They can adaptively reuse their structure. So even if the structure is not being modified, there's no requirement to come into compliance with the form-based code. You can actually do some fairly moderate and extensive modifications to the structure as well. So right now there's an allowance for up to a 40% addition to a structure, adding 40% of floor area to that building without triggering the form-based code. So that would just be run through the existing zoning and site process. So only when you exceed all of those things, so we're talking about a modification or expansion of a property beyond 40%, or an entirely new construction, so the demolition of an existing structure and redevelopment, that is when the form-based code would actually kick in and apply. So the East Boulder Subcommunity Plan and really the form-based code is intended to implement those recommendations, which include not only kind of the broad goals around uses within the plan, but also some of the more physical outcomes related to new streets, multi-use path connections, and those other types of connections that are identified here in the connections plan, and then also are now then incorporated into the regulating plans for the form-based code, which I'll touch on in just another slide. The other component is these place types that I described earlier. So if you remember from the subcommunity plan, this is where we start to try to describe kind of the organization of the types of uses within that larger, within those larger areas of change, try to create a little bit more granularity and identify where those types of uses are most appropriate within the buildings themselves as well. So those concepts and those ideas are now kind of incorporated into the form-based code itself. So moving into the regulating plans, which are really kind of the fundamental opportunity to describe what is expected of a property going forward. The regulating plans themselves, they define which building types are appropriate. We've also created something, a new thing called a base type, which I'll touch on in a minute. And those are also described within the regulating plans. They also identify the type A, B, or C frontage. So that is essentially just a description of the side of the building that is facing a street, whether it be a primary street or sort of a back of house or alley condition. And then the design requirements that are related to that. So those type A, B, and C frontages sort of set the framework for the types of materials, the type of architectural design that would be required for those different frontages. And then also just locate some key elements geographically. So what you're looking at here is the regulating plan from the 55th and Arapahoe Station area. You can see in those sort of dark purple lines along Conestoga and at the corner of 55th and Arapahoe, those are the identification of where the storefront building and storefront base would be required. So those are areas anticipated to be and intended to be more sort of ground floor retail and commercial type of activity, more pedestrian oriented. You can see the difference in the color where in the light blue area, that is from the place type diagram, that's the innovation TOD place type. And so there is a general building form that would apply there. On the western side, that's the innovation TOD non-residential. So there's a option to put in what's called the workshop building form that is would allow for a fully non-residential structure, so an office type of building or research and development or light manufacturing. And then you can also see the finer grain grid of streets that is being proposed. So if you're all familiar with the area, it's fairly suburban in nature, large lots, very few sort of street connections and cul-de-sacs. The regulating plan begins to introduce how that begins to break down into a more walkable type of neighborhood over time as those properties would redevelop. The last thing I'll touch on here is that the general building form, which is for the lighter blue area, the TOD area, allows for a height up to 5 stories and the maximum 55 feet, which is the height limit within the city of Boulder. That applies everywhere except for on the south side of Arapahoe, where there's a limitation to only 4 stories because of that adjacency to the existing residential neighborhood that is to the south there. For Valmont Park East and West, broad mix of different things that would be allowed, again, aligning with the place type designations in the subcommunity plan, primarily focused on a residential mix of type of uses that are adjacent to the park. So the east side there on the diagram on the left, or the west side there on the diagram on the right. Additional uses allowed within the workshop building and workshop base. So again, that's intended to really apply to these more industrial and light manufacturing or other types of business and industry type of uses that applies to the hands-on industrial place type. New streets, again, mapped as well. And then I did want to identify along the Goose Creek Greenway a requirement for an enhanced paseo, which is kind of a enhanced design for multi-use path and other pedestrian types of amenities along that Goose Creek path. That also would be an extension to a very similar enhanced paseo that was included within the recent amendments for the phase 2 of Boulder Junction, which is just on the western side of Foothills Parkway there. So trying to create a connection between these two plans and these two visions for areas that have somewhat similar character in terms of what they are today and what they're envisioned to be tomorrow. So the final regulating plan is for the Flatirons Business Park. Here you can see that and if you recall, the Innovation TOD place type extended north of the railroad tracks from that station area and applies to the portion of the business park that is along 55th Street, anticipated to become a future transit corridor. So wanted to be able to capture that. That's where the general building form would apply, and potentially if there were larger redevelopments, there would be a requirement for residential along that corridor. For the rest of the area, the eastern 2/3 of the business park in that darker blue area, you can see that's the destination workplace and the Main Street live work place types from the plan. That's where we would allow the option to do a general building form and include residential, or the workshop building type, which would allow for those non-residential and business and industry uses. There's a additional multi-use path connection that is shown through the area along the creek, additional street connections, and then one new thing that was introduced into the form-based code specifically for East Boulder is that there are, because of the nature of this existing conditions out there with some large parcels, we introduced some new regulations around large sites. So if those were to redevelop, so these would be areas that are greater than 4 acres. There's some additional requirements on overall size of block length and introduction of new streets. So even though those new connections, whether they be pedestrian or vehicular connections, are not explicitly shown on the regulating plan, if there were a larger site to redevelop, there would be the opportunity to think about that in a more robust way and show those and ultimately implement those through the project. The base types that I mentioned, so these work hand in hand with the overall building type framework. So basically, these are kind of plug and play into the overall building framework. There is a storefront base, which, as you would expect, is really intended to provide more of that kind of commercial retail type of experience and amenity along the street level. It's essentially at grade. There's requirements for a lot of glazing and transparency into those areas. It's allowed in any location across all these areas of change in the form-based code, but would be required at those key areas that were identified in the regulating plans. The general base is kind of the workhorse of the form-based code. Allows for a variety of different types of uses. And then specifically for East Boulder, we introduced this new workshop base that's really identified for these business and industry type of uses, light manufacturing, and particularly those that may need vehicular access on the ground floor. So that workshop base allows for things like roll-up garage doors and driveways in order to be located on those frontages. Another thing that was heard really throughout the subcommunity plan process and through some of the early consultations with others on the existing form-based code, and also this has come up actually in the Boulder Junction discussions as well, is how do we improve the existing code to introduce more articulation at the ground level, and in particular create some additional spaces for pedestrians and other micro mobility types of uses. So the proposed regulations within the updated form-based code introduce some rules around creating roof terraces and other types of things within the building itself, creating these courtyards sort of mid-block or along longer frontages, introducing streetscape plazas. There's a lot more flexibility for where the front of the building can be located relative to the street. So again, trying to allow for greater flexibility for the building to step back, create those spaces for outdoor dining, and mobility hubs and other types of things as well, like that. The other thing I did want to, let's see, I had one other point I was going to mention on this one, which I'm now losing, but it'll come back to me in a moment. Let's go to the next slide. Another comment that we heard really throughout this process and related to the existing form-based code that's in place is how do we address some of the development costs related to development under the form-based code. Currently, there's some pretty high standards for certain types of materials and other kinds of things, especially on those key frontages. So we've, especially in a place like East Boulder, we want to provide greater flexibility for a variety of different architectural styles and materials. So we've introduced some greater flexibility. There's fewer frontage requirements, particularly on those facades that are not facing primary streets. We've lowered some of the window and entrance requirements, again, particularly on those facades that are maybe facing a side street or are not visible from the street. And also introduced a lot more flexibility in terms of some of the materials that can be used. We've also introduced a few changes to the review procedures, again, to try to streamline that process, reduce some of those costs. So some of the application submittal requirements have been scaled back just a little bit in terms of the level of detail that's provided. In particular, there was a requirement for a really high level of detail on the windows that were being proposed that, quite frankly, at the time of review, the architecture is just not that developed. And so we were really asking for more information than would be appropriate at that time. Next one. So key element, of course, of the subcommunity plan is how do we envision East Boulder evolving over time and starting to introduce housing opportunities into what has primarily been a fairly one-dimensional, non-residential type of area. So right now, the way as proposed, the future zone districts map includes zones that allow for residential uses. We've also carried forward the requirement for larger buildings to include a portion of residential uses. This is actually an existing requirement within the form-based code that applies to Boulder Junction. And so particularly within those TOD areas, going ahead and carrying over that requirement for larger buildings to incorporate residential. And really the requirements for residential are limited to where housing is allowed by the zone district and where the building type would require that, knowing that there is a desire to continue to retain those production type of uses in this area. So we're not looking to entirely change East Boulder over into a residential area. That's certainly not the desire of the plan, and it's not the desire of these proposed updates. So finally, I will, I believe this is my second to last slide. So we've talked also a lot about how do we continue to support business and production uses in East Boulder going forward. A couple of different things, just as a reminder, the form-based code only applies to those areas of change. So really the vast majority of East Boulder will continue to exist and move forward as it does today. We've continued that flexibility for existing buildings and existing uses to expand up to 40% under their existing zoning, again, under their existing rules, so no form-based code requirements. The future zone districts that are in that map or that we would be applying going forward in a redevelopment scenario provide a very wide variety and flexibility for the types of uses. So they envision and anticipate this combination of both residential and some of these light manufacturing types of things going forward. Also created that workshop building and base, and then we've introduced a new requirement that would only apply to East Boulder for the requirement to provide production space on the ground floor. And so on the next slide, I'll speak to that briefly. So what that is on projects, redevelopment projects that are greater than 15,000 square feet, there would be a requirement to introduce 10% of that ground floor area to be considered production business space. There are some design requirements related to that production space. So certain building heights would have to, or floor to floor heights of that ground floor would have to be met. The allowance for garage door openings and other kinds of things. And the spaces themselves, we want to make sure that these are relatively small so that they can hopefully support smaller local businesses, retain some affordability in a redevelopment scenario. And also then there would be a list of allowed uses that could go into that production business space, which is actually pretty wide ranging from, kind of these food and beverage oriented types of production spaces, art studios and workshops, any of the industrial classification within our current code, within our current use code, vehicular repair and rental service, those kinds of things. The survey that we did with local businesses that Sarah mentioned earlier really provided us with some critical information from those tenants of what are the physical aspects or characteristics of the space that they would really need in a future redevelopment for them to be able to utilize a space like that. And with that, I'll go back to Sarah.
Yeah, thank you, KJ. And then just really quick. Sorry. Okay, next steps. So really quickly, just before we get to the discussion, I'd like to just go over the next steps so you know where we are. As I mentioned earlier, the public review draft has been posted to the website and it will be up until this Friday. And we'll continue to collect feedback and make refinements over the summer. And we'll be back in the fall with a final set of recommended updates, which will include an amendment to the subcommunity plan. And that will be include adding that future zoning map that KJ was talking about that will direct the zoning for redevelopment and new development. And that will require both planning board and council approval. And there will also be an ordinance to amend Title IX to update the form-based code, the use table, and any other relevant sections that we find we need to update as we're moving through this process with Hella, our esteemed attorney who has helped us amazingly through this process. And that will require planning board recommendation and council approval. And so just a reminder of our key question for you. Do you have questions related to the form-based code and the recommendations as they relate specifically to the recommendations of the East Boulder Subcommunity Plan? So that's our question for you. And whenever you're ready, Chairman Boone.
Great. Question for you on how this would be most helpful. I guess the first question is, should we ask any clarifying questions? I'm sure there's lots of conversation to be had, but maybe before we go into that conversation, if people didn't understand anything or if they have a specific clarifying question, and not commentary, but questions, I think that might be helpful for everyone. And then we can go into comments from the different board members. So I don't know if anyone has any clarifying questions. Kurt, you want to start? We can just probably go down the line this way. So go ahead.
Sure, sounds good. I have a number of questions. Thank you for all the presentation. Thank you for the memo and all the documentation. There's a lot there. There's a lot of details. With regards to the rezoning and the future zoning map, so the difference from the current scheme is that, first of all, the rezoning under a redevelopment, the rezoning would be required, right? As opposed to currently you could redevelop under your current zoning or potentially change the zoning. And you wouldn't have an option of which zoning consistent with the land use map you chose.
Yes, that's correct. So under the current proposal, that future zone district map would be included within the East Boulder Subcommunity Plan. And if a significant redevelopment or new development came forward, they would need to be consistent with that future zoning map. The intent really is to move this area and move Boulder towards the recommendations of the plan. And if in some cases the existing zoning would remain. So for example, there are some locations that are currently zoned as IG or industrial general, which that could be perfectly consistent with the plan and would carry forward. But there are other areas that might be IG today that we've envisioned as more of a transit-oriented development in the future. So those may be more appropriate then to be rezoned upon redevelopment into something like mixed use 4.
Yeah. Okay, great. Sounds good. I have a couple of questions about the place. What are they called? Not the place types. The maps of East Boulder.
The
Uh,
regulating plans, maybe?
Yeah, the regulating
There you
plans.
go.
Thank you. So the first one is basically about the 55th and Arapahoe area. You are showing, especially the corner of 55th and Arapahoe, as pedestrian oriented. You know, with the storefront type right at that corner.
Mm-hmm.
Is that gonna work?
Well,
I mean,
yeah, it's
Arapahoe
great.
is this giant
Yeah.
car sewer, right?
Yeah,
And
it's a-
55th is also giant. And how are we going to deal with that?
So yeah, a couple of thoughts related to that. So the regulating plans and really the sub-community plan have a 20 or so year time horizon, right? So anticipating that there will be changes to some of those roadways in the future that may make them more pedestrian and bicycle friendly, as an example. As far as Arapahoe in particular, there's studies for bus rapid transit along Arapahoe, and ultimately that location at 55th and Arapahoe there would be BRT stations on the west side and the east side of that intersection. So anticipating that there would be a number of people, boarding and getting off the bus at that location, adding and creating those storefront type of uses at that corner is really the intention. Your comment does echo a comment that we received from City Council, though, as well, that in some cases, some of the storefront locations are currently applied to areas that are today primarily vehicular oriented, and whether or not that is an appropriate location for those. So that's certainly something we're willing to take another look at.
Okay, thank you. And then for the regulating plan, around Sterling, you showed 3 stories you showed 4 stories along Sterling, and then to the north of that area, and then also to the south along Goose Creek, only 3 stories. Why only 3 stories?
That's in part because those sort of reddish tan areas are identified in the sub-community plan as the hands-on industrial areas. So that's really intended to continue to maintain this kind of smaller scale business and industry type of uses, rather than say a 5-story residential structure in that particular location. The residential components in the Valmont Park East and West areas are really more focused on the adjacency right to the park there and that green location.
But can't you have small scale uses in a 5-story building?
You could conceivably, but I think, as far as just the overall sort of consistency with the sub-community plan, and if you look at those place type descriptions in the sub-community plan, that hands-on industrial area was identified as being something that was slightly less intense than some of the TOD areas.
Okay. So I have 2 more questions then, kind of relating to the nexus with transportation. The first is about the street types, ABC, and the facade types. I'm trying to understand. So we currently have A and B, and we're adding C. I'm trying to understand how these connect to, like, whether they're more car-oriented streets, whether they're more closer. No, and paseos are separate, but whether we're getting more into sort of a Wunderf or I don't quite understand how those relate. And partly this is motivated by the notion that we're going to allow those garage fronts, now only on place type C, which I kind of had in my head as a more pedestrian friendly street. So can you clarify?
Yeah. So the type A and B and C frontages essentially define what those design characteristics are of the building as it faces that street, right? That frontage. In particular, the workshop base and allowing those garage doors, that would currently, as proposed, that would be allowed on a type C frontage or really a frontage that doesn't have that primary street visibility. The type C frontages that and the roll-up doors or the garage doors that are allowed within that workshop base are really intended for actual driveway vehicle access. So that would be either access to a parking garage that's within a building, or if it happened to be a vehicle service type of use, it would provide that access to that area. The roll-up doors that I think are starting to, see frequently related to cafes and restaurants and other things like that, those are perfectly allowed within some of those other base types on either a type or A or B frontage. So it's easy to get confused, but those roll-up doors from a experiential standpoint are still allowed on those frontages, but the true sort of garage door openings with vehicular access would be relegated to those secondary frontages on the type C.
So am I right in saying that the frontage type A, B, C has it's completely orthogonal to the character of the street in terms of its experience for different modes?
Not entirely. We fully recognize that we want to create and apply the type A frontage, so those highest level of design requirements, to those areas that are going to be most experienced by particularly pedestrians, and create those spaces, create those experiences. We are dealing with, an area that has traditionally been very car oriented. And so we are trying to sort of reconcile this challenge of the primary corridors that today tend to be vehicular, but could in the future be more pedestrian oriented, and balance where is it most appropriate to have those type A or B frontages. Again, your comments are kind of echoing some things we heard from council and others as well, that maybe those type A frontages aren't as appropriate along, say, 55th, which is a very car-dominated frontage today. Maybe some of those internal, smaller, more pedestrian-focused streets would be better for some of those conditions.
Okay, that's helpful. Can I ask one more?
Yeah, go ahead, ask one more.
Okay, thank you. So in Boulder Junction, we basically we're creating some new streets so we could do them the way we wanted. In Alpine Balsam, we're largely going to be creating new streets within the internal area. In East Boulder, especially in the Flatiron Park area, there's Central Avenue and there's Flatiron Parkway, and both of them are really big, wide streets. I think maybe partly originally designed because that was what you did in 1978 or whenever that was built. But also maybe with the notion of running semis through there or whatever. But they're not appropriate for the kind of form and experience that we want to create there. What can we do as part of the form-based code? I mean, it requires more than the form-based code, but what can we do as part of the form-based code to fix that? Narrow the streets or calm them or whatever?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I do think it's something that we are, we're challenged with in terms of in areas where form-based code has applied before. The city has owned a lot of that land, or at least held some control over how those areas redeveloped, and so we were able to shape how some of those outcomes really came to be. Although there were requirements and other expectations that were established in the form-based code, and so we kind of we had to follow our own rules through that. So in East Boulder, and as we, if we consider form-based code for the second phase of Boulder Junction, these are things that we'll have to reconcile in terms of the city doesn't own any land in these areas. So it's going to depend on private redevelopment over time. So there will be this condition where there's interim improvements that are made on a sort of parcel by parcel basis, but as far as a holistic re-envisioning of the street is not something that's likely, to be anticipated. So there are some requirements within the form-based code that are related to sidewalk location and street tree location and those kinds of things. The requirement to follow our current DCS standards that also require separated sidewalks and other more pedestrian amenities along street sections, those would all still apply and be required as part of any kind of individual redevelopment. So they would have to bring the street up to, up to those regulations as these projects come online over time.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. I have sort of big overarching questions, and can you explain the relationship between base types and place types?
Between base types and place types?
Correct.
Sure. So the place types, those were defined in the subcommunity plan. So they provide general guidance on the future character of the area. The base types are within the form-based code and are really intended to, if you remember within, this is going to get confusing. If you remember within the place types of the subcommunity plan, those diagrams that showed the sort of difference of uses on the ground floor versus what might be allowed on the second or third or fourth or fifth floor. So the base type is intended to start to introduce that concept on a regulatory level so that the base type, both from a physical form and design perspective, but also in terms of the types of uses that might be most appropriate in those locations, start to get applied. So the, specifically like the shopfront base that would require some of those more retail or commercial type of opportunities, those are focused in certain areas. You could use the shopfront base anywhere you want, but it might be required in certain locations. Same thing with the workshop base, which is more for those, business and industry type of uses. They might be required under a certain building form, but they could also potentially be used in other locations as well. So it's our best attempt to try to take that concept of the sub-community plan and then build that into, code requirements that would be part of a development review in the future.
So one of the, I think, interesting characteristics of place types was that they evolved in section. And does this base type accommodate that so that you don't get a building that doesn't do that place type evolution?
It does. It starts to introduce that. I would say that we've, for purposes of, I think, ease of administration for staff, but also, just thinking about how market forces react and trying not to be too prescriptive, I would say that the base types in the proposed code are more flexible than what's being shown in the subcommunity plan. So we, as staff, already sort of made that assumption that we needed to back off that specificity just a little bit, but it does introduce the notion of a difference of type of uses on the ground floor versus things that are happening up above. So it does introduce that notion of that vertical mix of uses in addition to just a mix of uses on the ground.
How do you introduce a notion at the code scale?
Well, some uses would be required or would be limited in terms of what you could what you could put into one of those base types. But also, just the physical nature of those base types might also guide the types of uses that would be best accommodated in there. The workshop building is a good example. So, you necessarily probably wouldn't use that workshop building base type unless you were anticipating either as an existing property owner or a future tenant. If you already had ideas about the types of uses that would go into that, you would use that workshop base if you knew that you wanted to support and promote and incorporate those more business and industry type of uses, if that makes sense.
Because I think one of the inherent values with the place type strategy in the East Boulder Subcommunity Plan was that you would get a mix and a diversity and you would not get a monoculture. And if this doesn't translate to the base types, you know, we could end up with all the same kinds of uses above the ground floor because it doesn't talk about the stratification and added complexity that was anticipated in that. So
I think it
That's
does.
my
I think
concern,
it,
I
yeah,
guess.
I think it does accomplish what you're talking about. And one other example I can point to is that the residential requirement that would apply in certain locations and under the general building form, the requirement is only 50% of the floor area. So conceivably, you could have a project that would have business or industrial type of uses on the ground floor. You could have 2 stories of office, and then you could have 2 stories of residential above that. So that would all be allowed and accommodated through the code.
right. I'll get back to that, but another question, looking at the regulating plan, how do those regulating plans accommodate what currently exists?
So again, the form-based code is really forward-looking and would only apply if there's a redevelopment or a substantial modification of a building more than 40% of the floor
Right.
area. So they anticipate and accommodate all of those existing uses that are on the ground today. So by adopting the form-based code and the application of those regulating plans, it does not create any nonconformities or issues until such time in the future when a redevelopment proposal would come forward.
So there's no referring back to what exists as part of what gets created in the future.
Well, in part, because actually a lot of the recommendations and the place types from the subcommunity plan are reflective of what's on the ground today and what we want to carry forward in terms of future vision for this area as really this kind of funky mix of, small maker spaces and other kinds of things, but then also allowing for those opportunities to introduce residential. So it really starts with the community process from the plan,
Right.
then documented in the plan, and now we've carried those ideas forward into the regulating plans and into the code.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the Main Street up in that Valmont, I guess one of the Valmont.
Exactly. Yep.
And there was a study done to document the cultural conditions that exist there. Did that get incorporated into the either the base types or regulatory plan? I didn't see any kind of a reference to there are layers of existing things that may not manifest in a footprint.
Sure.
Did that show up?
Yeah, it's really difficult to incorporate those kind of intangibles and the sort of organic nature of how these areas evolve over time into the code. And so what we've attempted to do is create a structure that allows for that type of thing to occur today and into the future. So the allowed uses, the flexibility in terms of the design of those structures, all of that is kind of built into the code itself to allow those things to happen going forward. And then related to that social infrastructure study in particular, that area, there's a number of different programs and concepts that are starting to be generated by our community vitality team. And, these are projects that are starting to take shape and will be worked on over the next couple of years. And so we think there's other additional opportunities through some programming, more of the sort of soft side of things, not the architectural side, but the soft side of programs to be able to support those types of uses and that interesting mix that occurs over time.
Great. Thank you. I really appreciate that because sometimes when we lay a plan on something, all the minutia that made it so wonderful, kind of vanishes.
Sure.
So I have one last question. Sorry, Mark. Let me find it. So, no, I think you might have answered it. How the FBC implements the place types. I think you've already answered that. So that was my question number 3. Mark, you are up. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you.
Okay. I'm kind of going in order as I came across these. So they range from kind of very small to giant conceptual questions. On page, this is on, every time I refer to a page number, it's a PDF of the packet. So page 20,
Got it.
I'm not sure exactly what that is. Under number 2, East Boulder place types, the packet says, creating varied architectural outcomes and varied roof lines. Specifically, how does the new code encourage varied roof lines? And is there any allowance for a pitched roof to equal the same height that we allow for screening? Right now, building height is measured to whatever point it is, but with a flat roof. And then the screening can go up a really long way.
Right.
So, and again, maybe I'm misinterpreting this, but a pitched roof is a whole nother animal. So does implementation of the form-based code in this area allow for roof lines, varied roof lines that actually can equal the height of screening?
Yeah, good question. So at its most basic in terms of the varied roof lines and the massing of the building, there are some new requirements related to those upper floors, essentially sort of scaling back or setting back from the frontage. So your experience as a pedestrian on the ground floor might only be a 3-story building, even though it might go up 5 stories above you. So trying to introduce those kinds of requirements so that you, as an experience from the street, you might see a 2-story section, you might see a 3-story, a 4-story section, but you rarely would get sort of the full volume of the building. As far as the pitch roof condition, we have talked about that, and certainly that is something that we've discussed within the staff team, and we recognize the desire for some of that architectural variability. Right now, the code does not allow, as far as I'm aware, of pitched roofs to be able to extend above that 55-foot height limit. I know there's a limit of any occupiable space that can't go above that. There are a few exceptions within the charter, if I remember correctly, for things like clock towers and a few other kind of elements. Exactly. Yeah. So I do think it's open for discussion. I do think that also it's probably a larger community question about, is that something that we as a community would be supportive of? I know that 55-foot height limit is a sensitive subject for a lot of folks. And Hella, it'd be great if you've got any information on that.
I was going to add something. In the form-based code, we actually have a requirement that mechanical equipment be incorporated into the building unless the building cannot function properly if it's incorporated into the building. So there is a little bit of a higher standard on what's within the building and what can be on the roof.
Okay. Okay. That's a varied answer, but all right. Okay. On page.
Can I just ask a colloquy on that? So, Mark, you were talking about a pitched roof, and Christopher, you answered it in terms of a 55-foot high building. But what about a building that's a 3-story building or a 4-story building?
Sure.
Could the pitched roof encompass what would otherwise be on the roof?
Yes. So to answer your question, yes, you're right. I was considering a building 4 or 5-story building going up to that maximum height. I will note that the workshop building that is allowed in some areas for those non-residential uses, that has a height story limit of 3 stories, but it does not have any additional foot height limit, so other than the 55 feet. So conceivably, you could have a very sort of architecturally interesting building with 3 stories in it and some varied roof pitches and other architectural elements that could conceivably extend up to 55 feet.
Great, thank you. On page 26, we talk about clarifications and cleanup. And back earlier this year, so what I'm going to get into is the relationship between East Boulder subcommunity place types, the underlying or overlaying zones, right? The zoning and the allowed uses. Does the implementation of form-based code and your note here that to clean up, remove unnecessary standards, reorganize sections for easier navigation, clean up inconsistencies, when earlier this year, we were given a consultant's really nice summary of what uses are allowed in a given zone. And those nice one-page summaries of what's allowed in a given zone, suddenly it was easy for me to see inconsistencies and stuff that was wacky. You can have a hotel and a hostel in a given zone, but you can't have a bed and breakfast. It's like, wait, stop. You know, you can grow crops, but you can't grow plants. It's like, what, you know, so does this adoption of the form-based code, I couldn't find where these cleanups and removing unnecessary standards, et cetera, are they here and I'm just missing them?
They are there, but it's part of a separate component. So when Kathleen was before you in March, we talked about kind of the first step of this, which was that future zoning map. And then we are proposing a couple of strategic use table updates to try to better match the outcomes and the recommendations of the plan with some of those, with some of the proposed zone districts and uses. So as an example, I think in IG, a brewery and restaurant, or a brewery or distillery is allowed, but it can't have a restaurant, so those are the kinds of things that we'd like to clean up. So we would bring back what we're anticipating doing in the fall when we come back after we've been able to gather all the information from yourselves and council and from the community, is we would have a full package of items. So the form-based code being one of them, those use table updates being a second component. And then we would also have to amend the sub-community plan to add that future zoning map. So there's kind of three pieces that we would need to bring forward as part of a full package of regulatory updates in the future.
Okay, thank you. I would look forward to some of those cleanups. In the draft, attachment A, I guess this is page 20, PDF page 26, street frontage types. So we say we want to potentially allow larger developments to create their own regulating plans using a set of guiding regulations. So I'm all for more flexibility, more creativity in streetscapes and street cross sections and this kind of stuff. However, we continue to struggle with the legacy of PUDs. And so is this just kind of opening up to another way to have a future set of, well, this big development decided they wanted to do this and we let them do it. And now 20 years later, we're like pulling our hair out, trying to find past agreements, et cetera. So my question would be, is this a good thing that is more flexible, or is it really we just need to concentrate on clarifying our code and having people adhere to the code?
Yeah, it's a great question. We, as a matter of fact, an earlier draft of the code updates had a much more detailed process actually defined for these large sites, which I mentioned earlier in the presentation, that are larger than 4 acres. We actually peeled that back through work with Charles's team and on the development review side, because we were nervous about establishing a PUD light type of process. So what we've done instead is within the code, and I could find the specific reference, but rather than establishing a new process that is related to that, we basically just define some very sort of basic framework for block lengths can be no longer than 350 feet. You must identify type A and B frontages, the sort of checklist of things that would ultimately need to be done as part of a larger site redevelopment. ultimately that would be, approved, and that development approval would carry forward. I think there would be less of an issue with individual agreements, or, if one piece of the property redevelops, it affects all the other pieces of the property, that kind of thing. So really, we've just tried to establish this baseline framework that's going to add the pedestrian connections or vehicular connections that are necessary, but the site itself can evolve over time, and individual pieces could be redeveloped, separate from one another and independent of one another.
Okay. A mundane one, then a big one, and I'll be done. Okay. Under Paseo design on page 62, you mentioned non-motorized vehicles. So with the advent of page 62 of the packet, with the advent of e-bikes, et cetera, there are fewer and fewer vehicles that are not motorized, truly not motorized. And I understand what I think your intention was, motorized like cars, motorcycles, et cetera. But I think that does that need attention in terms of a definition of a non-motorized vehicle? Or do you really want pedestrian, like walking?
That's a really, I commend your attention to detail, I have to say. That's a great point. I do think that we should define that to be more clear about what that is. The Paseos really are intended to be more of a pedestrian experience as opposed to a multi-use path that can serve more of a transportation related purpose. And so I think we'll need to take a closer look at that and either introduce a new definition or add some detail to that to make sure that it's clear.
Okay. All right. Final one. And I want to ask this as a question because I think this is something for discussion later. Would you agree with Mr. Painter's characterization, Mr. Painter, of the attorney at Holland and Hart, representing the largest landowner in Flatirons Industrial Park? Would you agree with his characterization of what council's intention and the East Boulder subcommunity plans intentions were around the what I interpret as a new requirement rather than a advocacy for or incentive for. Anyway, do you agree with the way he's characterized things in his letter that he sent late this afternoon?
Well, regardless of my personal opinions, based on the process that Kathleen led through, for 3 years through the subcommunity process, obviously multiple meetings with yourselves and city council throughout that process. She was, she's the lead of this project and was through the beginning up through March or April when she left for parental leave. So all of the sort of history of the subcommunity planning process carried through the beginnings of this project and ultimately led to these recommendations that are before you. We went back and we reviewed a lot of the meeting tapes even before 2022, as Mr. Painter alluded to. And we, our staff interpretation and the direction that we received from council at that adoption hearing in October was to ensure that there was flexibility for continuation of business and industry uses, but that there was also an important interest in introducing residential into these areas, and in particular, the anticipated future transit areas. So we brought forward a proposal. It appears that, perhaps we have received some comments and concerns both from community members and also from council that we may have gone a step too far. But as far as what staff's interpretation of the direction was and what our interpretation of the subcommunity plan was that this was an appropriate proposal at this time.
Okay, thank you.
I don't really have much. I'm kind of listening. So.
Okay. I have just a couple of questions
Great.
related to residential. Big surprise. So could you remind me, when we did the East Boulder subcommunity plan and we adopted it, what was the estimate of how many housing units it would produce under the place types?
Oh,
I
I'm
seem to
gonna
recall
have-
it was around 5,000.
I was going to say 5,000. I do have the plan in front of me. I could right here on page 14. Opportunity by the numbers, potentially up to 5,000 new homes and potentially an additional 3,000 jobs of what is there today.
Okay. And I think what I'm hearing from the staff presentation and from the packet is that there's been a little bit of a backing away from requiring residential in the place types. You know, the place types used to have two place types that required housing above the first floor, and that was the neighborhood TOD place type. Sorry, not the neighborhood TOD, the innovation TOD residential, so the pink on the western edge of the Flatirons Business Park and then extending into the, the station area, and then also the Parkside residential. Both of those had required only housing and only housing, or potentially some parking as well in the innovation TOD residential, but housing above the first floor. And it sounds like that's no longer the case, that has not been carried through into what is before us now with the form-based code. Am I understanding that correctly?
Well, we have carried forward the requirement for residential uses in new projects that are greater than 15,000 square feet in those TOD areas or the Parkside residential areas. So it's, it kind of depends on how you would look at it. If it's an existing use today and you wanted to continue that existing use and even expand your project or expand the structure up to 40%, you could still continue to do that under existing zoning and regulations. There would be no residential requirement, really only in the case of that full redevelopment scenario. If the project were larger than 15,000 square feet, that's when a 50% residential requirement would apply.
So it's been changed then. So instead of it being everything above the first floor has to be residential, it's half of it would have to be residential, but only if it's a larger project over 15,000.
That's correct. Yeah, there's a little bit of additional flexibility there.
Okay. And have you done any calculations on how the new form-based code, what you expect it to produce in terms of housing to compare to what was expected before?
Yeah, we haven't done any additional land use scenario testing. I will say that when we did those original estimates as part of the sub-community plan, as I understand it, we did not anticipate residential within the Flatirons Business Park area. So those numbers would still hold true even if we made some adjustments to where those residential requirements might apply in the future.
So even on the Main Street live work, you weren't counting any live.
Correct.
Work.
As I understand it, yes.
Okay. And is that including the innovation TOD area to the west, on the west edge?
It does, yeah.
Okay. That you were not counting on that to be residential?
Correct, that we were not including that in those original estimates. So really, we were focused on the station area and some of the other areas of change, but for the most part, the entirety of the business park was not included in those estimates.
So that 5,000 units, you were expecting it to come out of just the station area and the Parkside residential?
Correct.
Okay. I must have missed that during the process. Okay, thank you. Those are my questions.
Mm-hmm. Great, Claudia.
I'm just going to listen for now.
Mason.
A couple small things. In the East Boulder subcommunity plan, these areas are mentioned as how does it say? Areas proposed for land use changes and updates. There are two smaller parcels, I think, to the southwest, like Arapahoe 63rd, that I didn't see in this. Am I just being silly, or are they not being considered at this time?
Those areas, I believe that was an error in that diagram. So those areas are not included in the areas of change. If you're looking all the way out east at 63rd and Arapahoe.
Great. Cool. I was reading the playground space part of this, and it talked about, I know one of the challenges is trying to make sure that we have spaces for families and kids to feel comfortable, playing outside. And there's a requirement for a playground space every 200 units of housing in this. So that's within the project itself. So if there's a large building, say, that has 200 units, they have to put in playgrounds somewhere.
That's what's currently proposed in the code.
Okay. Go ahead. Yeah.
So was the second part of your question or the unasked part? So if I have 3 buildings that are 100 units each, then we have no playgrounds. Is that? Yeah.
If they were 3 individual sites and 3 individual projects, correct, that would not apply then.
Great. That makes sense. How was that 200 unit number chosen?
We used certain best practices research of, generally the number of units in anticipation of the, size of households and number of children that might be produced through a development of that size.
Okay. I'd love to have more education there just because I don't have those best practices, under my belt, or really even, I understand the words that you're saying, but I don't have any context for that to have deep meaning for me. There was another part about trees. More questions about how numbers were chosen. In the yards, let's see here, see my notes. For streets, it was like every 100 or 1,000 square feet, which is basically every 32 feet squared, roughly. And then for yards and setbacks, it was every 1,500 square feet. There should be a tree where possible. I forgot the exact wording. How are those numbers selected?
Well, the street side ones would be more based on some of our existing DCS standards of, the spacing of trees along streets. And so anticipating that, and then knowing that we want to continue to introduce landscape and shade and other things into some of those hardscape plaza or areas that are adjacent to the roadway. That's where we came up with that 1,500 square feet to have, still have a requirement, but somewhat less of a requirement than a street tree requirement.
So it's fair to say that's just consistent with other work.
Right.
I'm sorry if I missed this in your presentation. Is there a similar process for getting exceptions to this coming to the planning board, or? Yeah,
there is an existing exceptions process, and Hella, I don't know if you probably know that process better than I, or if the illustrious Charles Farrow would like to opine on that.
Yeah, I'm gonna look it up real quick. There is an exception process, and it's actually pretty broad. I think there are several ways to get an exception granted, and one of them might only require a demonstration that the intent of the regulation is still being met in a different way. And then there are some exceptions where we have a historic building or where something's not really possible to do. But I'll look it up. We do have that set up.
Okay. Thanks. Yeah, I would just like to learn more about that. And my last question, I'm sorry, I do have 2 more questions. So I know that there's the new zoning, and this is just me being new. I'm not super familiar with it. Has there been any effort to simplify the overlay, the zoning associated with this, now that this is an added complexity?
Yeah, it's a good question. So we had an option, as we started this process to develop the form-based code and then apply the new underlying zoning, because the underlying zoning is what really establishes what uses are allowed within those form-based code areas. We had an option to actually create a new zone district, and we politely declined to do that, in part because of the complexity of the land use code as it exists today. So we reviewed our existing zone districts, compared them against the recommendations of the plan, and that's partly why we're proposing to use zone districts that are already on the books, but make a few minor tweaks to the uses that are allowed so that they better align with the recommendations of the plan and wouldn't have, significant impacts in those same zone districts if they're applied in other locations across the city.
And I saved my worst for last. This is potentially a harebrained question. But I was wondering if you had any examples of large industrial buildings that have residential in it as like a potential guide for how successful that is or how maybe unsuccessful it is.
It's a good question. I can't think of any in Boulder specifically, and we can speak to our code consultant because my suspicion is she may have some ideas of other examples in other cities where those exist.
And on top of that, I'm wondering if where my mind went, which is again maybe a naive place, but where my mind went was we're losing, it seems, a fair amount of our industrial stock in other areas of town, and that's largely due to just how much can be charged per square foot, right? So I was wondering if maybe having the mix would lead to longevity of industrial uses because there's an opportunity to get more square footage. There wouldn't be as much desire, but I don't know if that's.
I don't think you're too far off base. I mean, I think what we're anticipating or what we're hoping for is that the market responds in a way that there are redevelopment opportunities that continue to support these types of business and industry uses, and at the same time start to introduce residential into this area. It's possible that if those two things were mixed within a single project, the residential revenue can help to offset some of the costs for some of those non-residential types of spaces. In particular, too, just thinking about the proposed requirement for that business production space. We were intentional about trying to keep those spaces relatively small. So rather than having to bring in a national chain tenant, making sure that they're small and hopefully then affordable enough for local and small entrepreneurs to come in and occupy those spaces.
Thank you. That's all I have.
And Mason, I can follow up on your question. I've looked up the exception section, and I wanted to mention you didn't see that amongst the form-based code you reviewed because there is a section in the code that kind of sets up the review process for form-based code, and that's where it's located. It's in section 9.2.16. And the broadest exception is an exception that can be granted if what's proposed is consistent with the goals and intents of the adopted area plan applied to the area, and the proposed exception will not create an adverse impact on residents of the development or surrounding properties beyond what would ordinarily be expected through implementation of the form-based code. So there's a pretty broad standard to apply. And then 3 more possible exceptions. One, if there would be negative impact on the historic character of a landmark or building within a historic district. 1, in case the code would result in a violation of federal or state law that wasn't anticipated when drafting. And the last one is when there is a condition of the property that was not created by the applicant that makes compliance impracticable.
All right. Super quick. Yeah, I guess I was going to ask, does anyone have any other clarifying questions besides Mark? Mark, you can go ahead and start. And then.
In the presentation, there was mention of a majority of planning board members required to call up an item. That was just in reference to East Boulder subcommunity plan or form-based code areas operating under form-based
correct,
code.
just under the form-based code, right?
Okay.
Because the long-term intention is for form-based code to eventually become more of an administrative review, and so I think council was expressing that desire for a majority of planning board members to be able to call those up.
Okay, thank you.
If I might just clarify a comment I made earlier as well. Kalani was able to confirm that, and in fact, we did include some residential units within that total anticipated or estimated number of units. for the Flatirons Business Park within the sub-community plan. So I wanted to clarify the record on that. The assumption that we included within those estimates was approximately 1,000 units within the Flatirons Business Park as a whole. So again, that residential would, if we were to change the code as it's currently proposed now to remove that requirement, residential would still be allowed within that area. And so we certainly could still see a realization of some or even all of those units going forward.
Thank you. I do have a follow-up.
Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I'm very sorry to be dense and a little slow on this, but could we pull up the map of the whole area?
Sure.
And could you just walk us through, I say us, I mean me, could you walk me through where residential is allowed and where you would anticipate that 50% to kick in? What would make that 50% kick in those areas where it's allowed, other than just a building size and a base type that's governed by the I'm just getting a little confused of how all that overlays and where we think we can actually get some residential.
Sure. Go ahead and pull up the regulating plans. I think that'll be. Yeah, we'll flip through each of the regulating plans and see if we can detail this. So starting with the station area plan. So basically everything that you see in light blue, and let me just double check that really quickly too. Just need to pull this up on my side.
So the light blue is the areas that were the innovation TOD and or residential and the neighborhood TOD.
That's right. So everything that you see on the screen and in the 55th and Arapahoe station area regulating plan, everything that's in the light blue would require the general building form. And if that new development were to be larger than the 15,000 square foot threshold, then 50% would be required to be residential.
So the only way they could get around it is by building a lot of tiny separate buildings.
That would be one way, potentially. Yes. Yes. Or if there was an existing structure that had a non-residential type of use and they just repurposed that structure or potentially added to it, that kind of thing. So those uses could continue forward in that way. But if there was a full redevelopment, then that residential component would apply.
Okay.
Okay, so the next one, let me see. So I believe in both Belmont Park East and West, there is an option to either use the general form, which would also continue to carry that residential requirement, or you could use the workshop building form, which allows for that smaller scale 3-story non-residential building. The one exception to that is the green areas, which are the Parkside residential. Those require both either the general building form or the row building form, and those both have a residential requirement for them.
So in the green, if they redevelop, residential is required for 50% if it's over 15,000 square feet. And in the rest of the areas, they could use a building form where residential is not required.
That is correct. And actually, I believe, let me just double check on the row building form quickly, because I believe that may only allow residential above the ground floor. But let me just double check. That one may also have the 50% residential. I would have to confirm on the row building form a little bit.
Can I chime in here as I'm reading it on the row building type? All frontages and stories allow all uses consistent with chapter 9.6.
Yeah, that's what I was reading as well. So that's why that's something I'm going to want to follow up with our code consultant on that question.
So in that the row building type, they don't have the 50% requirement if they're over 15,000 square feet?
That's what I want to follow up on, because I think the expectation is that within that row building form, that would be a residential use,
Okay,
or conceivably a non-residential use on the ground floor, but certainly above the ground floor. The intention would be for that to be residential.
okay. And so even the areas that are in the sort of purple color that were the Main Street live work in the East Boulder subcommunity plan, those will not necessarily contain any residential upon redevelopment.
They would not necessarily require residential within future redevelopment. They would have the option of either using that smaller 3-story workshop building type, or they'd be encouraged potentially to use the 5-story general form. So that additional height, additional intensity might be of interest to somebody, but then that would also carry the residential requirement.
Useful to know. Thank you.
And then the last one, in the business park, currently, as proposed, everything that is in the light blue would be limited to that general form with the residential requirement.
Okay, thank you.
Light blue is
The western third, the western third right along 55th there. And then on the
saying the light blue, the western would require residential,
as currently proposed, yes.
If it's over a certain size threshold, yeah.
but not the stuff to the east farther in the park.
That is correct, yes.
And that includes that eastern edge along the creek there that was envisioned as being, I think, the Main Street live work.
Yes, also correct. That would include the option to use the 3-story workshop building or the 5-story general building.
Okay,
with
so if they
residential.
want the taller building, then they have the 50%.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
All right. Thank you.
Other questions before we get into commentary?
Just following up a little more on Laura's excellent questions. Do we have any kind of modeling then of what, and I know it's very difficult, but what the residential production actually would be under the current scheme?
We
as compared to
haven't
that 5,000?
run any additional land use scenario tests, but we fully expect that it would be in line with what the recommendations of the plan would be. So we still would anticipate, in that 5,000 unit range conceivably across this whole area over time.
Thanks.
I'm going to suggest that we take a quick 5-minute break. Let's see. Yeah, why don't we get back here at 7:45, so 8 minutes. And then at which time, I think what we'll end up doing is maybe time capping our commentary for first round for kind of 4 to 5 minutes each member. And then if we've got a follow-up, we'll do that. Okay, great. We'll see everybody back here at 7:45. Anybody got a bag? I don't think there's anybody on. All right, we're going to reconvene. We had dinner delivered during break, so people are eating on video. That's why. I think a nice, efficient way would be to provide you back comments from each board member, for each board member, not to try to be redundant, but if they agree with something that somebody else has said, please share that as well. Like everyone, to try to keep their comments to about 4 minutes each. We'll do a second round if we need to. I'm going to try to cut people off at 5 minutes, and then again, people will have unlimited time if they want to make comments, but I want to try to be fair to everyone and make sure that everyone gets to put in their 2 cents. I'm not necessarily going to go down the line, but if there's someone that wants to go first,
I can go first.
Laura is going to go first. Great.
So in reading this, my primary concern was, of course, for residential, because that's one of the things that I really appreciated about this plan. And I just want to commend staff. I think that you have done an excellent job of balancing the concerns around preserving light industrial space, providing flexibility, and also trying to ensure that we do get some residential production out of this. That was one of the main themes of the East Boulder Subcommunity Plan, was trying to create new neighborhoods that have that funky industrialness, that still preserve the character of the neighborhood, but that bring more people in to appreciate the artistic and funky and industrial nature of this area, and be customers for those businesses, and provide just a more mixed use neighborhood. So I think you've done a great job. I really appreciate the walkthrough that you did of showing how the regulating plans and the base types and the zoning combine to make this vision really a reality. And I think that was a big challenge, and I think you rose to the occasion, and I just want to say thank you, and I'm very pleased with the result. And those are my comments for now.
All right. Anybody want to go next? Sure. ML.
Thank you. So thank you very much. You know, I really appreciate the challenge in trying to codify place. I think that was the leap you were asked to make, because the East Boulder Subcommunity Plan was based on place types. And necessarily those were articulated in the community subplan in 3 dimensions. Thus my questions about how do we make that happen? My concern, and that you're branching out to say it isn't just the code that's going to help hold this in place. It's going to be these other additional. I think I commend that. I think that that's a holistic way to begin to attend to a community plan, because that's a really big task. So my main concern is, and you know, I ask for this in so many different ways all the time, understanding how the impacts of the information, of the processes that we put into place, what are the impacts to our goals around work? How many jobs are we bringing into town? Since we don't have in that Flatiron area, I mean, I was understanding when we first reviewed the East Boulder Subcommunity Plan that strip along the creek there was really going to be focused on residential. And now to see that they don't have to put any residential in there if they don't, you know, given the threshold you've put out there. I think it would be really important to find ways to project what are the impacts if this is built out with, and we've already heard from that one project and that developer that owns all, they don't do housing. What happens if they build it all out in living science buildings and we don't get a single drop of residential? What happens if we only get residential and other? Let's articulate the extreme edges and see if the things that we are proposing, the codification, is going to, in fact, where are we going to land? We know we won't hit the extremes, but it's good to know because we speculate and we think we're upholding our values, the intent of this community plan to create a community. And are we going to miss the mark? So that would be the concern that I would put on the table, is to start analyzing the consequences of some of these things that we're putting together. Otherwise, brilliant job. You're doing great work. Thank you so much.
All right. Someone next.
I can go.
Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, I had two main concerns. One was regarding the change to how we're regulating the residential, and I came into this meeting, I guess, pretty concerned about what was being proposed, but I feel significantly better now. And so at least as things stand, I would support what's being proposed with the threshold of the 15,000 square foot building and the base types and the whole scheme. My biggest concern, as maybe was indicated by my questions, is about the relationship to the transportation system and how we deal with these existing roads, streets that are just very unfriendly. The design and construction standard doesn't really help us a lot there, partly because it explicitly says it's a minimum standard. And so it doesn't really provide any mechanism, for instance, for narrowing a street that was constructed originally too large. And so I think that there's more work to be done there, certainly with regards to the design and construction standards, but maybe I would like to see us think about how we can also incorporate some of that into what we're doing here with the form-based code. But overall, I think it's a great job.
I can go next because I don't have too many commentaries. I agree generally with what ML said, which is, and I thought it was highlighted with Laura's questions around just understanding a little bit better. I think for us and for our comfort with it, when it comes back, to really have some clarity, I think it will help with the community sort of just understand what kind of outcomes we think we will actually be able to achieve. We can do a little bit more work on that. I think that would be helpful. I thought Mason had some really interesting questions that highlighted some other things that are worth being investigated, around, especially around when we talk about housing and uses, and as something that's near and dear to a lot of us, around sort of making sure that we're bringing in families and we have spaces to accommodate those. I thought the question around playgrounds, is that the right number? Doesn't feel like it is to me, certainly when you start having multiple buildings within the same project. So I would ask that if we have best practices around that, to highlight it, and if not, maybe there's an opportunity to go back and take another look at that, along with sort of the open spaces that those provide. There is one other area we talk about, sort of alternative uses to residential, and I know, and even in one of those areas around sort of that 10% usage, I'm gonna actually find my note on that, around research and development. I want to make sure that when we talk about research and development, it isn't just code for someone to put an office space in. And I don't know if that's super clear, at least in here, but I'd ask to really clarify that, so we don't get sort of Trojan horse Class A office in spaces that are really targeted for light industrial. So those are my comments.
Thanks. I actually want to start building on something that George mentioned. And again, Mason's questions about the playgrounds. It brought up this issue of outdoor spaces to me. And I share your concerns that that's not the right number or potentially even way to regulate that. And I'm just curious if there is a way we can think about outdoor space needs in this area based more on things like square footage, residential square footage, as we've gone to in other portions of the code, to try to disincentivize having fewer units, larger units, et cetera, but to really look at providing for different unit footprints that are going to get us that space. The other thing that's on my mind after this discussion is how we are looking at the A, B, and C building frontages and streets in this plan. And I am somewhat concerned that, those highest design standards are being put on what really are car-oriented streets, where they may have a larger effect on a pedestrian landscape if they are put on some of those secondary streets. So really thinking about what we're trying to do when we talk about what the front of a building is, what the back is. I would really hate to see some of these paseos and smaller alleyways that are being planned in become kind of the real dumping ground for backsides of buildings when they actually could be very nice community spaces and passageways.
So I concur with folks here that this is great work, and the overall goals are really important to bring certainty and simplification to redeveloping the East Boulder subcommunity area. I think the real question, though, here is the mandate to require housing. For me, this is the heart of the question: is how do you do that without creating some really strange, potentially strange outlying situations? Because when we think about housing, when I think about housing and I think about mixed use, I think about second and third floor above a shop of some kind, a small manufacturing space, R&D center, whatever it might be. I think about the East Coast and even the Midwest of the US and older areas that were developed in the early 20th century and stuff. Brick buildings, 2 and 3 stories tall. That's like cool mixed use, lofts, etc. When I think about requiring residential in a 120,000 square foot life sciences, laboratory, which there's many potentials for that in the Flatirons Industrial Park, that doesn't feel like the kind of mixed use that I think about, and nor do I think that the BVCP thinks about, which I just quote: "The city will preserve existing industrial areas as places for industry and innovation, and will pursue regulatory changes to better allow for housing. The city will encourage redevelopment and infill to contribute to placemaking." And the placing, so when I think about 55th and Arapahoe, and I think about a lot of housing there, that's great. When I think about, again, 20 units tacked onto the side of a giant life sciences building, like we did the concept review for the other day, that doesn't feel so great at all. So I think that's the tension there between the East Boulder subcommunity's plan of goals for housing, our whole community's goal for more housing and more mixed use and placemaking, and then interjecting a use into a space that I don't know if we're ever going to overcome the character of Flatirons Industrial Park. It is an industrial park, and I don't know what threshold, what requirement is right for demanding residential inside a building that may have a really just incompatible use in terms of these life sciences buildings we've been reviewing. Really tall, 2 floors, but they're 45 feet tall or whatever. And again, it's like the mix of uses there feels super incongruous. And I'm not a cheerleader for this, what I perceive to be a bubble in the life sciences building market. Not at all. I'm a housing cheerleader, but I just, that feels, the way this is come about, it doesn't feel like, it feels like there could be some really bad outcomes. So.
Yeah, I'll jump on the bandwagon. Great job. Really great presentation, easy to follow, and really great work on putting this together. I think the thing I liked the most about it is how much flexibility there appears to be in this while meeting the goals, the stated goals of the plan. I feel like the flexibility really is going, that I like so much, is going to rely a lot on how this interacts with the zoning updates. I know that one, at least in my reading, preparing for this, the one issue that I saw people keep commenting on with form-based codes is that it can add a lot of complexity if it isn't thoughtfully integrated with Euclidean zoning and land use. So I know that you guys are thinking about that. I know that you guys will do a good job with it, but just wanted to point it out that that's really important. Playground's been talked about by a couple other folks. I agree with the comment that maybe square footage is a better way to go to try to incentivize the right thing. You know, I was just looking at some rough back of the envelope numbers, and if you assume a 800 square foot per unit, 200 units comes out to 160,000 square feet. I don't know how many buildings we're going to get of that size, and I don't know if my math is reasonable in my assumptions, but I feel like that's almost 3 times the size of what I would expect when you start thinking about, 30 kids at a school uses one playground. Anyway, I'm going to build on Kurt's comment and kind of nitpick on the courtyard requirement along Arapahoe and 55th. I like that, but it does only work if there are major changes to those roads. So I'm not fully attuned to what plans there are there, but I feel like you can't have one without the other. Otherwise, it's just not going to make much sense. And I would like to see courtyards and store frontages and all that along those roads. So interested in hearing more on that development. And then I guess just as for my follow-up for my own personal education, if you do find that example on industrial residential mixes and hopefully maybe additional information on how that impacts the longevity of industrial stock, I would be excited to learn more about that. And I think others would be too. I feel like that's part of the fears of our community is losing the industrial stock. So if this can be an incentive in terms of helping the longevity of that stock, I think people would appreciate knowing that. That's all I got.
Great. Any follow-up final thoughts from anybody? I'll just second something that Claudia said, which I marked too, and I didn't bring up in mine, was I don't know whether I fully agree that, degrading the material standards along sort of the B and C facades necessarily. I don't know that that's driving a major amount of cost, but there could be long-term major benefit to not maybe taking another look at that. So just wanted to support that. Anybody else? Kurt?
I had a bunch of other just very minor, some of them we just typos and stuff like that. Would it be appropriate to just send them by email? Yeah. Hella says yes. Great.
Anybody else? Oh, thanks, guys. Really appreciate you walking us through that. All right, that closes that portion. I think all that's left is any additional matters, items from anybody? Brad, I don't know if you have anything.
Well, excuse me, Brad Mueller, Planning and Development Services.
You did that just for the audience.
I did, for the big audience we have here. As we embark on the summer, it can be tempting to imagine that there's a little bit of a lull, but I will assure you that the amount of activity that we're still seeing come in, both on specific projects that you see, but also these planning projects are ramping up quite considerably. And we're very mindful of the fact that the update to the comprehensive plan is going to be kicking off this fall. Christopher's entire team and indeed the whole department is very mindful and ramping up for that. So there's a lot of work in the background that's being done, both reacting to the applications that are coming in that you see more frequently than the administrative items, but a whole lot on the administrative side too. So we appreciate all the good work that the teams are doing, and appreciate your support in that regard too. And you can anticipate quite a bit more in that regard. Other than that, just appreciate your time, and thank you again for your understanding about our food situation. Please take food home, and thank you as always for your service. Any questions for me? Looks like there might be one or two.
Yeah, Kurt. Go ahead.
I have a question. My understanding is that the state prohibition on occupancy limits goes into effect July 1st. Is that your understanding?
Yeah, and we've functionally not been enforcing on that. So we've made some, we've done some internal coordination on what that means in terms of follow-up when we get complaints, what it looks like in our documentation and things online. So those are getting updated. We will be going back to council with some code updates, which you'll obviously see before them. The dates are a little fluid right now. They're in the fall, and essentially because it already is known law at the state level, it's not a time-sensitive thing that we get those done. We just want to get that cleanup taken care of.
Okay, so we won't be actually in violation of the law?
No, I mean,
okay,
it's unenforceable law at this point that we've got on the books, so.
Okay.
Yeah, that's true also for a little bit with ADUs and a little bit with, well, I think that's it for now, but we've got other state laws that we'll be making adjustments to. The transit-oriented communities will require action over time. We've got a good year and a half on that. We've got some state opportunities for psilocybin medical considerations as well. So that's part of what I'm alluding to in terms of the teams being very busy, and that includes Hella and company. There's a lot that's being brought to the attorney's office for regular review. So everybody's keeping busy.
Great, thank you.
If we have no other additional items, I just want to touch on our calendar. Next meeting is July 16th. That's our only other meeting in July, and then it's August 6th. So we don't have, we have some pretty decent breaks. As it relates to myself, I don't know whether I'll be at the July 16th meeting, but either way, I'll be remote in a pretty far away time zone. So I'll need someone else to chair it. I don't think we should remotely chair if we don't have the opportunity to. So I don't know if Mark, you'll be available. Okay, so Mark will take on that responsibility. Anybody else have any comments as far as schedule goes, or things that we should be aware of for the 16th or maybe for the 6th?
George, we do actually have a meeting scheduled for July 23rd as well.
We do?
Yeah, there's a public hearing currently scheduled for that meeting.
Oh, I'm looking at the website. I don't see it on the website.
Okay, we'll need to get our website updated to reflect that then.
Okay.
I still have it in, 16th and 23rd.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the upcoming events
right.
on the website, which may be what the public's looking at.
That
So.
would explain our attendance.
All right. So the 23rd, I'll be in the same situation. I don't know. Yeah. So, okay. Good. Okay. Great.
I did have one other thing I forgot.
Yeah.
I want to congratulate Sarah for her first successful presentation in front of you. So, that's always a milestone. So we appreciate that, and we appreciate her and her stepping in and helping while Kathleen's been out a little bit. So, thanks.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Unless anyone else said anything else, we'll adjourn the meeting. Thanks.